You are listening to an Acts Academy presentation of the Bachelor of Integrated Biblical Studies.
First of all, I want to heartily welcome and introduce Dr. Richard Nanakan, as we call him Ricky Uncle. He is the Vice Chancellor of Acts Academy of Higher Education. He has been the principal of this academy for a long time. He is an excellent teacher, a pastor, a leader, and a man of God. And I think that is a wonderful introduction that I would like to give to Uncle. And it has been a privilege and an honor to be with him and under him, being part of the ministry. It has been an enriching and a learning experience to most of the faculty and also the students, and particularly me. So welcome you, Uncle, for this evening and also for the course as we begin to learn. And the course will be Discovering Old Testament, a thematic study of the revelation of God in history. So Uncle will be teaching that. Also, I would like to welcome Mr. Ebenezer, who is a teaching faculty here, and also the chaplain and the Dean of Practice Ministry. Sir has been a pastor also as well. He is a counselor. So we are very happy. He will be part of the panel discussion and also involved helping us in this program, particularly the course Discovering the Old Testament. So welcome you, sir, Mr. Ebenezer, to this class and also in the days to come. As I had told you, we also have Brother Bhima Palak, who has joined us to this course. And one more is Prasad Rao. I don't know whether he has not joined, but he said he will be joining, but he is not there. And to all of you, welcome you this evening for this course. Now, as we begin this course, we will have the video we will watch the video of the introduction that Dr. Ricky has already given. We will watch that and then we will go for the teaching. Over for the video, please.
Hello friends, welcome once again for the online learning. Now we are going to study the second subject of cluster 1, and this is called Discovering the Old Testament, a thematic study of the revelation of God in history. We have Dr. Richard Nanakan, the Vice Chancellor of Acts Academy of Higher Education, who will teach this course for us.
Any study of the Old Testament must take into consideration God's plan and purposes for humankind. In our course, what we will do is to look at the creation understanding of God, what He intended to do when He created men and women. We will further go on to study some of the covenants that God made with important people. For instance, the covenant that God made with Abraham, with David, and what were the implications of these covenants when you look at the coming of the Messiah. That itself is an interesting subject, but we will not be able to take too much of time on that because we will be just doing a briefer understanding of some of the themes of the Old Testament. We will look at some of the themes in the wisdom literature because that is where you get another perspective of God's plans for humankind and how the writers of these books looked at God, His majesty, His power, His creations, how he sustained creation. We will then go on to study some of the book of the prophets, because the prophets had an entirely different perspective that the other people had. They were in the business of constantly speaking to the people about God's purposes, God's intention for man, and their constant cry was calling the people to return to God. So, all in all, as we look at the Old Testament and as we look at all these various themes, we will be focusing our main attention on scriptures in the sense of what the expectations were in the Old Testament of the coming Messiah. And my own understanding of the Old Testament is that it's an exciting study. It keeps us understanding the purposes and plans of God and what He intended to do, how He created the world first, how He sustained it, and when men and women sinned, how He sent the Messiah to rescue us from our sin and to continue His good purposes for all of creation. So, I wish you all the very best as you begin this course, and I pray that God will bless you and lead you into a deeper knowledge and insight of who this Almighty God is.
Thank you, Dr. Richard Gnanakan.
I hand over this time to Uncle Ricky to take over and to teach this course, the outline as well as the unit 1 of this course. Over to Dr. Ricky.
Thank you, Sunil, and good evening to each one of you who is attending this online class. I pray that together we will be able to get something of an understanding of what God was doing when He began this world. Now, our Old Testament consists of 39 books, which are divided into basically 3 sections: the Pentateuch, which are the 5 books of Moses, the prophets, and the writings. Now, this was the scripture that Jesus knew and mentions this when He expounded the scripture to the disciples on the road to Emmaus. And we read that in Luke chapter 24 and verse 27. So as we begin exploring the Old Testament, it is good to begin right at the beginning. Okay, there you are. On the screen is the division of the Old Testament. You've got 5 sections, which is according to the English Bible. So the Pentateuch, Genesis to Deuteronomy, the historical books, Joshua to Esther, the poetical books, Job to the Song of Solomon, the major prophetical books, Isaiah to Daniel, and then the minor prophets. Now, don't confuse minor to be people with a lesser ministry or a lesser message. They were equally strong and they were equal to the major prophets, but because the books are smaller in terms of content, they have been classified as the minor prophetical books, which is from Hosea to Malachi. Okay, the author of the book of Genesis, which is the first of the books, is considered to be Moses, although Moses himself lived many years after these events were recorded. Now, how did he do it? Moses would have collected oral traditions, and oral traditions that pass down from generation to generation. You know, some of our rural people who are illiterate, the way they recall things from the past and then tell you what happened, say, even 100 years ago, is incredible. And probably this is how Moses would have also collected all these oral traditions, and he puts them down in written form. The record of the beginning, then Genesis, especially these first 11 chapters, they comprise the origins which are really prehistoric to us. And it has to do with how the world began and how God created. Now, one thing for us to remember as we go along in our understanding of these first 11 chapters, and then the rest of the Old Testament too, we should remember that this is not history from a human perspective. So maybe you will find many events that happen are not recorded, but what is recorded from God's perspective. Hence, the events recorded follow a very particular pattern, and we will see that as we go along, and especially as we begin to understand these first 11 books and the unit 1, which takes us through some of the events that we want you to understand. Okay, I think we'll go to the next slide. That might help us then. Okay, the first thing is the creation account. Now, this Genesis account of creation you find in the first 2 chapters of Genesis. Now, each of these chapters records for us a creation account. If you look at Genesis chapter 1, creation follows the pattern of day 1, day 2, day 3, so on. It goes on till day 7 in the beginning of chapter 2, when God takes his rest. So chapter 1 gives you an account of how everything was created. Now when you come to chapter 2, especially this section that we see, Genesis chapter 2, 4b to the 3rd chapter and verse 24, not just Genesis 2, but we're going into 3 also to just understand how the whole book has been organized. Now the first section was the general creation account detailing what God created in those days. But now when you come to the second section in chapter 2, it deals with a garden. It deals with how God takes Adam and Eve and then puts them in a garden. And if you ask me what is the takeaway from these first 2 or even the 3 chapters, I believe it is Genesis 1:28, the first one, and then Genesis 2:15. Now if we move on in the slide, we will get to what Genesis 1:28 is all about. Listen to this. God blessed Adam and Eve and says to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Now, this, as many of us understand, is what we call the creation mandate. God created Adam and Eve and he gives them a mandate. What is it? Be fruitful, increase, fill the earth, take control of it. Subdue is a very interesting word, because subdue is not a word with the impact that we give to it, like kingdoms subduing smaller kingdoms, bigger kings with their bigger armies coming and subduing people. Subdue in the Hebrew Bible has a very beautiful connotation. Subdue is what God uses the term, and Moses records it for us as meaning take control. And take control again is a very pastoral term, like a pastor is asked to show concern for the congregation members. A pastor is told how to look after the needy in his congregation, or how to address some of the issues that may be troubling the congregation members. He was not subduing them in the sense like a king subduing a smaller king. He was taking care of them, controlling them. Now that one comes out very well when you look at Genesis chapter 15. The Lord took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to take care of it. So, my brothers and sisters, when we look at that creation mandate, which actually talks about subjugation, subduing, we're actually looking at what God intended. Take control. You are now put in charge of creation. God created in 6 days, created Adam and Eve, and then on the 7th day he rested. And in that rest, man and woman, Adam and Eve, began to take care of the creation that God handed over to them. There are 3 more accounts of creation that you find in the Old Testament. Probably they are important accounts, but not as important as the Genesis passages where we talk or we hear about God telling us that we are to be fruitful, increase, take care of it. Some of the environmental damage that has been caused over the recent years or over the hundreds of years of the existence of the humankind has been because of a lack of understanding of care for the environment. People cutting down trees to make wood for all kinds of furniture and other things. People drilling down deep into the ground to get water, maybe going down to bring out the resources that are hidden in the inside, have all done damage to our environment, our creation. So that's a little thing that we should remember as we move on in this first unit of ours. Let's have the next panel, please. Okay, now when you come to the next section, which is Genesis 3 to Genesis 5, we see how sin makes inroads into our lives. And now I'm not going to give you verse by verse exposition of these chapters, but what I have put down is just briefly for us to be able to understand this evening. But when you go back, please take time to read these chapters. Look at the chapters, chapters 3 to 5. A corruption of the plan of God. What was the intention of God? Take control of the world I have created. What happens in Genesis 3? Man, the crown of his creation, commits the gravest mistake of his life. He listens, he and Eve put together are tempted to break God's commands. The result is they're thrown out of the Garden of Eden that they were to develop. Remember chapter 2 and verse 15. God says, take control of the world. And he created this garden and put them there. Genesis 3, they are tempted, and the result is by the end of after the curses, you will see 3 curses there. The first curse, falling on the woman. Child labor will be painful. Second one, falling on the serpent. And then on man. And man also had to toil, to labor, because God said everything that you now try to extract from the earth will be through the sweat of the brow, through pain, through hard labor. So that was the first thing that happens in Genesis chapter 3. By the time you come to Genesis 4, Cain and Abel. Cain is very jealous of Abel, and then he kills Abel. And so this sin that began with the serpent tempting Adam and Eve results in murder, and that just started getting compounded. Now there are 2 consequences of that sin. Firstly, God's purposes are harmed because of disobedience. Secondly, they will now have to work without God directly involved in the development of His created order. Go back to chapter 2, where God said, take care. And then if you come to the end of chapter 2 and then into chapter 3, you realize that Adam and Eve were working in collaboration with God. God was coming to them almost every afternoon and saying, how's it going? What's happening? And then after their sin, when they were hiding, God comes and he says, Adam, where are you? I mean, we were to have our session together. We were to go and look at how we were going to take care of all of this creation. But where are you? Why are you in hiding? And then they had to say, we have sinned. So we see how it goes on, chapter 4. Then chapter 5, which traces the genealogy from Adam to Noah. Now again, we might say, were they the only people living there? We don't know. But from God's perspective, this was the interesting genealogy that we had to find out and we had to learn. Adam to Noah. And after we read through that genealogy in chapter 5, Moses has prepared the ground for us to get into the next event, which was a global catastrophe of significant consequences. We'll go to our panel 3. The flood. Now this is one of the big events of the early prehistoric days of the beginnings of the earth. The big flood, the great flood. Human beings increase in number, so does sin, so does disobedience, and God speaks of it as great wickedness in Genesis 6 and chapter 5. God is now compelled to cause the destruction of the world in his response to verse 7. However, Noah finds favor in the Lord's eyes and is chosen to bring about a restoration of his plans and purposes. After the end of the flood. Genesis 8 informs us that God changes his mind and is ready to give the world another chance. Now, when you read these chapters, you will find that very, very interesting. And when you read it with your understanding of how God was moving amongst people, it's even more exciting. Genesis 9, God makes a covenant, the first covenant really. The creation mandate could be termed as a covenant too, but it was a mandate that God gave to his creation, Adam and Eve, how to care for the earth. But here is a covenant that God makes with Noah when the floods subside. And in a sense, there is a happy ending and there is a new beginning. We'll move to the our fourth subsection in Unit 1, which is our last one, is called the nations, Genesis 10 and 11. Chapter 10 is a record of the partial development on the human race and the sons of Noah. Special mention is made of the Canaanites, since it was their land that was called the land of milk and honey. And it was this land that was going to be given to the descendants of Abraham. And Abraham comes from the family of Shem, one of Noah's sons. He was a descendant of Shem, and the rest of the Old Testament is all about Abraham's descendants. In chapter 11, we encounter an effort of human beings coming together to build that big tower at Babel. Remember that? That's something we all learned in Sunday school. Whereas God's intention was for them to take control of the earth, to spread out over the entire world, here was a plan by the people to build a tower that will reach up to where God is. Now, God had to break that effort through a very unique act. The people suddenly started talking in different languages, and they are divided and dispersed to different geographic areas. There is a suggestion that distinct races began at this time. And so, again, we read all about this, and the chapter ends with the generations of Shem leading up to Abraham. Roughly 2,000 years of early history is covered in these first 11 chapters. And by the time we get ready for the second section, there is an overview of God's act now at an end, and the call of Abraham. Moses is ready to take us through that second major section of the Old Testament. I hope that by looking at these first 11 chapters, just you now get a perspective of how God created the world, what he intended for the world, and how Adam and Eve responded, how his children respond, and how God has to break all these plans of them reaching up to heaven. And then this one leads us up to the next section when Moses is, not Moses, but when Abraham is called by God to leave all and to go out and get into the land of Canaan. Thank you. I trust you have learned something this evening, and we will now move into our discussion or whatever has been planned in the session. Over to you, Sunil.
Thank you, Uncle. Thank you very much. It was excellent and a very clear picture or a story of the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. The creation, the fall, the flood, and the nations. I think that's a wonderful progression that we saw, and the themes are very clearly explained. Thank you, Uncle. Thank you very much. Now, may I request Pastor Bhima Palak not to unmute. Keep it mute. We will open when it is necessary because it disturbs. Pastor Bhima? Okay. Now, over to all of us for clarifications. You have any doubts or any questions that you want to ask about, you want to know, please do ask. We will find the answer. We will try to find the answer.
Sir, does this suggest, like last you told, sir, that the earth was divided geographically? Is it true that the earth was a single piece of a land first before it was divided?
If you read Genesis chapter 1, God created the world. So he created it with all the geographical distinctions that exist. However, as he began to develop it, it was the Garden of Eden, which was the first place.
Yes.
And then from the Garden of Eden, the intention was that this family that was chosen by God would spread out and take control of the world, which of course they were not very keen to do. So they wanted to build a tower to reach up to God and probably bring the world to an end at that time itself. But the geographical distinctions were there right from the day one of creation.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. Anyone else from the class that you learned, from the teachings that we had? I'm sure you have had the points with you.
Dr. Ricky, we were informed that there are 2 Genesis accounts, is it?
Yes,
Or
yes.
maybe more. How, I mean, in what way, I mean, why were there 2 and then are they complementary?
Yeah, I think you've answered the question, Brother Tony. The first account of generation probably was the intention to give an overview of creation. So therefore, you had day 1, day 2, day 3, and it went on till day 6, and then day 7, God rests. And when God rests, man and woman are put into action. They were to take control of the world. Now, in the second account of creation that was complementary, God only introduces us to the Garden of Eden, which was the place where Adam and Eve were to begin their work. When I teach my students, I always used to mention saying, Garden of Eden was their training ground. They were to learn and they were to then expand. But I think before they learned their job, they thought it was more exciting to listen to Satan and the serpent, and they disobeyed God, and in that disobedience they were thrown out.
A good question, yes. First one is an elaboration. The second is a compilation of what has happened. Now, okay. Anyone else? Okay. Now we will move to the discussion panel. We have 2 questions we call reflective questions, reflections from the class that we have had. We have even Mr. Ebenezer, the faculty of Acts Academy, who will also be helping us in discussing and understanding. And students also can participate in this. Now, the first question is, explain humans or man and woman. Humans, the crown of creation created in the image of God. And also, God blessed them to be fruitful and subdue the earth. So the question is, what is the meaning of subdue the earth, which Uncle has already explained, probably we can elaborate on that. And what is the role of the church and the Christians in the light of these profound statements?
A very interesting question, and I'm glad that we have got those two words, fruitful and subdue, highlighted. Again, just to elaborate on the word subdue, it comes from a Hebrew word, and translated subdue is really not the right translation. As I mentioned, the word in the original Hebrew was a word that carried a priestly function. And that priestly function was to take care of people, look after the congregation, provide for the needy, look after the sick, take care of the downtrodden. I mean, it's the same kind of impact that this word has. So when we talk about humans being the crown of creation, the crown of creation was because we had the gift of a language. We had the gift of a more creative brain. And God intended that we should be able to take care of this earth. So subduing is not really the despotic meaning that we attach when, say, India invades any land or somebody else invades India. I mean, it's not that kind of a meaning. The connotation really is that we, as God's creation, are to take care of creation, to look after it, just as God intended as priests to look after creation. So let me leave it at that, and maybe Sunil or Ebenezer.
Yes, thank you. Sir Ebenezer, would you like to throw some light on the image of God, your explanation of the image of God, please?
Uh, the way I see it, I think Uncle put it very nicely. But also, I just would like to add here, the image also can mean sharing the responsibility along with God. That is one thing. And one more thing, we are created as a moral being, as a we have a relationship with God, and not only we have a relationship with God, but also a relationship with one another, each other. So that comes into a picture where through our relationship we honor God, or we bring glory to God. That is one thing. And one more word that I would like to add along with subdue is the word that I'm thinking of, stewardship. That's very important for us to understand that how we are going to handle what God has given to us. So that is a place where the subdue matters a lot, because we are partakers of that work that God has begun. So we are into that. In one way, we have that stewardship or responsibility towards what God has given to us.
Thank you. Thank you. Very true, and thank you very much. And I just would like to add the image of God. It is not the physical, it is more of the spiritual or the intellectual that God has given us. And one of the things when I teach, always say the free will that we have, the freedom, the free will that we have as a human is something which is very unique. And that's one of the reasons that God gave the freedom to Adam and Eve to take care of the earth, to be free there. So it's something that you will have to learn. And then even as Ebenezer sir put, The image of God also reflects about the relationship. We are relational. Human are created as relational being. No other creation has this ability to this extent, and also the responsibility. When we say God was responsible for mankind, and we are responsible to mankind as well as to God. So these are some of the images that we talk about. It's not just the physical image. There is no God is spirit in one sense, and therefore image we need to understand this. And subdue is very clearly mentioned. It is about now, the third part, what is the role of the church and the Christians in the light of these profound statements?
Okay. What is the role of the church and the Christians in the light of these statements? I always feel that we have to do our little part to take care of God's creation, to take control, to look after it. So, I mean, when you say church, we don't really mean it's a very large group of people, but in the early church, there were smaller groups of people. And when you talk about taking control of the world, the role of the church is definitely to take care of your little backyard or to take care of your little environment. Now, when we look at something like that happening, I believe that if each one of us did our bit to protect the world that God has created, to take care of it, nurture it, and to use the word that Ebenezer introduced us, to be stewards of God's creation, then we begin where we are. And like Adam and Eve having to begin in the Garden of Eden, we begin where we are and we do our best to influence anyone in our sphere who will be able to learn how we care for the earth and how we put these into practice.
Thank you. Thank you, Uncle. Correct. Exactly. I like that word, to take care, and that's the word you used. And I think when we combine this, the image of God and take care of the earth also involves take care of the humans. And to this, Uncle was adding the word, the pastoral and the priestly. That is something which is very important. Caring, nurturing, building. And so, friends, we are responsible for the earth. We are responsible. The church is responsible, and we have a greater responsibility. And I think that's a wonderful statement that Uncle made. Anybody wants to add to this or want to clarify more from this? Okay, we'll go to the second one. You can even ask the question later also. The second one is, it was explained in Unit 2. There are two consequences. First, God's purposes are harmed because of disobedience. And the second, they will have to work without God, directly involved in this development of His created order. Now, I think that was a very wonderful statement. Working without God, directly involving ourselves in the development order because of the disobedience. So, Uncle, please give more enlightenment on that.
Okay. Now, a very interesting statement there is that Adam and Eve had to work with God not being involved in the development of the Garden of Eden or even the outside of the Garden of Eden. Now, how does this happen? As I mentioned, when God created Adam and Eve, He intended that they will work under his supervision. How do we know this? If you read the Genesis 2 account, you will read that God creates everything. Now, man and woman were not called to be creative, at least at that time. So everything was created by God, and God put them in the Garden of Eden, and then he nurtures them in their learning process. So I think if you had to fulfill the creation mandate, or you had to fulfill your work in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve had to work in cooperation with God. And that's a very important word again, the cooperation, because when we look at these creation accounts, what we understand was God actually installs Adam and Eve as his co-workers to take care of the world. So naturally he was interested in creating, and he was interested in teaching Adam and Eve how to take care of the Garden of Eden. But then when they sinned, God banishes them and they are thrown out. And you remember the cherubim with a flashing sword was standing there so that they could never return to the Garden of Eden. I think in many ways that same implication takes us through the Bible right to Revelations, where the longing is for us to get back to the Garden of Eden, where God was working with us. Now the implication, when you look at it, yes, if I am working and I am working without the help of God, what is the use of my work? Whereas if I was working with God's help, which is different, say, in the days since Jesus Christ, we now have a better, relationship with God, and we have some of that help. But then, in that early days, they were just thrown out of the Garden of Eden. There was no help. And without help, they couldn't do anything on this world. And that's why they were doing all the wrong things. Anybody can add anything else, maybe Sunil or Ebenezer.
Is it not the same even today, Uncle? Like, man is trying to do everything without God, and you see the chaos all around the world, and it has come to the height of it.
Amen.
And I think it's time, like the Garden of Eden, to realize for man to when they were thrown out, in the sense, like, to think back to work with God. So is it a calling for us to work with God even now?
Good point. We are called. And I think those of us who have accepted the Lord Jesus Christ as our Savior have been restored into fellowship with God. Therefore, there is a marked difference in the way we work. Whereas the person who doesn't know God, doesn't know the Lord Jesus Christ, continue to work in that situation where God is not with them. Good point. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Brother Ebenezer, anything you want to add to that? The implication part, what could be the implication of it? The second part.
I'm thinking if I have to come to implication, I also need to touch the first part a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm thinking like when I'm connecting Sunil, your thought, and Uncle Ricky's thought, see, the disobedience comes from the place where man wanted to be God. Right? That's what the temptation that put forth, that if you do this, then you will become God, something like that.
Exactly.
So men were tempted, and that is the reason why Uncle Ricky underlined that beautiful picture of man building a Babylon without God. And even till today, whatever that we try to build without God, it's the same result, chaos. Especially when we think of the word Babel or Babylon, it's exactly that's what it means, confusion. So I believe man fall into this disobedience. It's because when we break the relationship with God, we automatically go to that point of disobedience. And when we sometimes think of doing work without God by trusting our own strength, our wisdom, our knowledge, or whatever it is, but all the time God calls us to have that fellowship. And even in the Old Testament, that is the reason why God has always asked us to keep that Sabbath, or a day for us to look back and do your work 6 days and come back and think about me, or come have a fellowship with me. That's what and he is also calling the people of Israelites. And the same thing that Jesus has done. When it comes to the implication, I believe I also wanted to underline the rest that Jesus has offered. Of course, yes, we are working, we have pain, we are toiling, we have all that struggle, but at the same time, it is His grace that enables us. It is His rest that comforts us. Even today, it helps us to think like Him. And John 15, I'm thinking about the branches remaining with, the vine. And without me, you can do nothing. That's what, Jesus also says. So I'm thinking if we work with God, and I believe we will do exactly what He is intended for us to do.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Wonderful. We all have done a good job. Now, again, any questions from the students, the participants? Please. I am enjoying this. I am sure you are.
Yes, sir, I have a question.
Yes.
When you all said that God did not involve Himself with Adam and Eve once He sent them out of the Garden of Eden, why does He then involve Himself with Cain and Abel's issue?
I mean, it's God intended that Adam and Eve would work under His supervision and look after the earth. But when He withdrew Himself at the end of chapter 3, He didn't withdraw Himself from the world He created. So therefore, when Cain murders Abel, God says, his blood is really required from you. I mean, it was more than involvement. It was the punishment of Adam and Eve that now continues as sin is compounding. So my simple answer is that God did not withdraw Himself from the world He created. He still had an interest, and that is why He continues to deal with His people. And then He makes that covenant with Noah. He calls Abraham, and all of those acts that continue through Genesis inform us that He had a deep interest in His creation. He allowed us, by the choice of our will, to do what we want, but His interest in His world continues.
Yeah. And also, I would like to add that it was man who was not interested. The man who was running away, and the sinful heart, the mind, was not able to identify with God, not able to see God. And that's the problem even today. They make their own gods and try to say this is God, and not knowing that they are going away from God. So that's it. That's a very good question, madam. Thank you very much. Brother Ebenezer, you want to add anything, or anybody has another question?
Yes, I too have one question, sir.
Yes, ma'am.
Then what is the difference between tree of life and the knowledge tree of good and evil?
You're, you're asking a very deep question now.
In Genesis 2 only, Uncle Ricky.
Yeah.
I know. I know.
Chapter 2, verse 10.
Yeah.
Tree of the knowledge of good and evil, is that?
Between the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
I think we just have to synthesize all together, because the tree of life was also the tree of knowledge, the tree of good and evil. I think that's the only way you have to say. It's not like God has created many trees. One is the tree of life, one is the tree of knowledge. I think we just have to look at it as one. There are some difficult passages, I do agree. But as I mentioned, in right at the beginning of our study, God's perspective is to give to us the story of how He created the world and how He sustained it later on, how He makes the provision for sustaining it too. So I think let's synthesize the two trees and bring them together as one.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you, Uncle.
Yeah. Thank you. Ebenezer, sir, you want to add to that?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. Everybody have their own perspective.
Interpretation. Yeah.
Yes. The way I see it as a test. Instead of getting into the argument or discussion about the tree, for me, I wanted to stay with the place where God wanted to test the faithfulness of Adam and Eve. So that's where they failed. Maybe overstepping the boundary. Even that goes with us today. That happened to wilderness when people of Israelites were traveling. So the test is always part of our life, even from the very beginning.
Okay.
So whether it is tree or whether it is knowledge or good or whatever it is, but I wanted to call it as a test.
And that's how the author has put. Madam, just one word answer is that's how the author has put. It's a why we are saying it's a difficult question is because there is an answer. It is highly theological. So one simple answer, even to combine together, that's how the author has communicated to us. It's in a story form, a picture form, and that's how he has communicated to us. So we will look into that probably later or personally and get into that. But a good question and good observation. Thank you very much. Thank you. Anybody else?
Thank you, Dr. Sun.
I had a little doubt about this image.
Okay.
Brother Ebenezer, this is the question for you. Image. You said like it is relationship and also spiritual, like what exactly you meant by that image? You did.
See, there is, if you look into the Hebrew word, image is something that relates to a sculpture, a person creates. But when I look at the word image, and also I wanted to take that when God breathed into the person, he became life, or he became a human being, a living thing. So that very life gave him the sense of God, to live a holy life, to take care of the earth that God has given, and especially he was carrying that glory of God. So by the time he missed that opportunity of continuing to live in that relationship, he lost something. It was corrupted. So if you look into that, I want to combine everything. Sometimes it can be a physical where you build or you create and you share that, potentiality of God in making something, and also your moral or discipline that God has given to us. So if all those things can be taken into the consideration.
Now,
Thank you.
I am tempted to tell you. Now, what is the image of God, madam?
God's image is human's image according to him. I
See,
made
God's
you in my
image.
image.
Okay.
The
Now,
spiritual image, you mean?
exactly. God's image is spirit. God says, God is spirit. Now,
Yeah.
the spirit, the word is ruah in Hebrew, which means the breath, the life, the spirit. So the spirit, the breath that we carry, we have, the life is from God. And the image that we carry, which is unique to God, is we are relational, we are responsible. You see, none of the other creation has any kind of relational responsibility. And the image is we can think and we have that free will. So that is one of the images of God. There are much more to that. It is to know clearly that the breath and the life that is there, which is eternal. The breath that we have is eternal, and that's why even at the end, either man will be in his life either with God or without God, in heaven or in hell. So there is that life. So we'll go into that. But anyway, good question. Good question.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
My question is,
Yes.
when He created everything and even God created the humans,
Mhm.
He knew everything, though He kept the tree. And when they were supposed to sin, why did not God protect them there?
Okay.
Later on, we see in Isaac's story, when
Okay.
Abraham was supposed to put a knife on his son, then God came in between. And why did not God come here? And when Cain was also tempted, why did not God come here? Why did God allow to happen this?
Okay. Good question. Very common question for all the theologians, but it's a very tough one. Over to Uncle, please.
I think the only way we can look at it is, we may not find answers to some of these questions. Why did God create? We don't know, but He created. Why did God create Adam and Eve? We don't know, but He did.
Hello?
Why did God not prevent, say,
Hello?
Adam and Eve from sinning? I mean, that's also a difficult question for us to answer, because some of these, no matter how hard we try, we may not be able to give you an answer that will satisfy you. Sufficient for us is the fact that God created Adam and Eve, and then Adam and Eve had children. Cain and Abel got into trouble. Why? Why God allowed the good man to die is a difficult question for us to answer. But when they were without God at that point of time, they were definitely wondering how to please God, how to get back to God. And that's why Abel's sacrifices, which was pleasing to God, was such a detesting thing for, say, Cain. But by the time you come to Noah, God regrets. Regrets and makes a new covenant with Abraham, never again to destroy, never again to kind of bring something like the flood there. And then there was a restoration of what God was wanting to do. So, in one sense, after the flood and after Noah, by the time Abraham is called, God is involving himself again in some ways, because these are people whom he called. He calls Abraham and he tests Abraham. That's why he tells him to go and offer Isaac, his only son, as a sacrifice. But when he was happy that Abraham was willing to trust God more than to trust, say, his own intellect or his understanding, when he was willing to do that, God comes between and says, stop, you will not sacrifice your son. I mean, many questions that we may not be able to answer, but in the history of salvation, in the history of what God is trying to tell us, these are events that happen. And these are events that tell us how God continued to be involved in nurturing his creation. I hope I've been able to answer you.
Thank you, Uncle. Thank you. Nivedita, can I add to this, Uncle? Can I?
Please do, please do.
Yeah, please. Now, I've been repeating the word free will. I'm sure you have heard that word. See, the free will is something that God has uniquely given to human beings. And I believe, and I've even as I've read, the free will is a freedom, and that is one of the major image of God that we carry. Now, when God gave them the responsibility or to be with the authority, as we talked about, to take care of the earth and so on, and to be careful about to not to eat the fruit. Okay. Now, they had the freedom. Now, the question is, why did not God overtrade or bypass the freedom? Now that itself, if he had, that itself will nullify, or that itself will stop the understanding of free will. You see, God did not want to overtake the free will that man has, and how God has created. That's one of the understanding. And adding to that, even as Uncle was talking about how God did intervene in a different way because of the sin. Thank you. Thank you. One more, the last one.
Can I just add to this?
Yes, ma'am.
This Vandana here.
Yes, yes.
We can also see in Job's life where
Yeah.
God has allowed Satan to test his faith, and repeatedly Satan was tormenting Job, and where we see that Job has passed his test. I think God tests us and allows certain things to happen in our life only to check our faith and strengthen us in his faith.
Yeah. Thank you. Good, good, very good, very good. Now we will go over to the assignment question because we are running out and out of time. We'll go to the assignment question. Now the question is very clear, very simple. Discuss the creation mandate given to Adam and Eve. It is explained clearly what was the mandate or what was the command, what was the purpose. Many things were talked about, and analyze its implications in the light of the fall and the flood. What effect did it have in the area of our daily work? That's the question. Akal, you want to give a little thought on this or explain a bit on this?
Yeah. Okay. The first part of the question is very clear. It's what you have learned. You've got the Genesis account, the creation mandate. So you discuss what the creation mandate means or what it meant for Adam and Eve. Then when you say analyze its implication in the light of the fall and the flood, I think it is trying to now look at how did this really affect, or how did it affect the life after the fall and the flood. Now, the third part of it is directly relating to what we are doing in our time. What is the effect of this, say, creation mandate in the area of our daily work? How do I fulfill the creation mandate of taking control, of caring for the earth, of caring for what God has created in the area of my daily work? So it's bringing it directly to our present day and how we have to work that out. So I think it's a nice question which doesn't just keep you at the head, but you've got to relate it to how you work today.
Thank you, Uncle. Very clear. Now, this will be about 2,000 words as you have been doing in the previous assignments. And of course, you submitted before last week, end of this week. Many of you have sent the assignments and some have not. Of the previous class, please do. I will also send you some more material, so probably 2-3 books we have. It's a soft copy. I will be forwarding it to you. Please read through whenever you find time. Please read before you begin to answer. And the teaching is taken from these books, the material that Uncle has given, and also the teachings from the books that I will be forwarding it to you.
I just wanted to say thank you to you all, especially to Ricky sir. Today we really enjoyed the class.
Yeah, I know. Thank you very much. Thank you, one and all of you. Yes, thank you, one and all. Thank you for your active participation, and thanks a lot to Ricky Uncle. It was lovely. We all enjoyed. Thank you, Ebenezer sir. Thank you, all of you. Good night. Good night. God
Thank you.
bless.
Good night.
Good night. God
Good
bless
night.
you all.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, sir. Good night, sir.
Good night.
Welcome.
You are listening to an Acts Academy presentation of the Bachelor of Integrated Biblical Studies.